What is up, everyone? It is Alex West, host of the AN1 podcast, reminding you to subscribe on SoundCloud, on YouTube, on iTunes, wherever you get your podcast, to follow me on Twitter at AlexWestNBA, follow the show on Twitter at AN1 Analytics. Today, Simon Cherin-Gordon joins the program. He is a man who wears many hats. He is the host of the Restricted Area podcast, the host of the YouTube series The Swingmen, which airs every Friday. He is also a writer for the 94 Feet Report, and he is a writer for Hoops Habit covering the Warriors. And that's what we talk about today, because Simon is not just a pretty face. He's a man with some really great Warriors opinions. We talk about Steph Curry's recurrent ankle injury. We talk about the dangers of the on-off switch, and we talk about possibly the decline of Draymond Green. We'll see who says what about that, but give it a listen. It's a pretty good podcast. So, Brent, take us away. I'm joined by my guest today, Simon Cherin-Gordon, and we were discussing in pre-show how I should introduce you to the guests, and it came up that you're sort of a media guru. You're the host of The Swingmen, presented by the 94 Feet Report, our own show. You're the host of the Restricted Area podcast, your own podcast. You also are a fantastic writer for the 94 Feet Report, and also cover the Warriors for Hoops Habit. So you're just a man who wears a lot of hats. Simon, how you doing, man?
I'm doing great, Alex. I think that's probably the most flattering introduction I've ever gotten. Hopefully I can live up to it on the pod.
I think I've worked with you for a couple of months now, and I feel like you do live up to it. But I said the Hoops Habit thing as sort of a lead-in, because that's what I want to talk to you about today. You cover the Warriors extensively. You watch them extensively. And I know people in the league have kind of gotten bored of talking about the Warriors, and that's just something that's happened, over the past couple of years. It goes with success. The same thing happened with the Michael Jordan Bulls teams. You saw Jordan not win a couple of MVPs just because of fatigue. And I think that's the point where we're at with the Warriors. But if anything, when you look at the roster this year and you look at the things that they've gone through this year, this is probably the most interesting iteration of the Warriors to me, because of the injuries, because of the seeming on-off switch. There are just a lot of things that are going on with the Warriors that are really interesting. And we've got a month before the playoffs, so I felt like now would be a good time to talk about these things and sort of flesh them out.
Yeah, Alex, it's interesting that you say that. I do get the feeling that people don't talk about the Warriors pretty much throughout, even last year when Durant was a novelty there, and it was this new thing that everyone spent all summer talking about. They kind of got brushed off during the season. Like, yeah, this team's going to win the title. There are more interesting things going on in the league right now, like a guy averaging a triple-double and, whatever you may have. And that was the case this year, too, until this adversity hit. And it almost takes something like that, or a team like Houston, which I'm sure we'll get into later, rising up to maybe a comparable level for people to actually start watching this team and thinking about them again.
This team has been so good for the past several seasons. When you start to break them down by month, even this year, I mean, they're 53-18. They're in first place in the Pacific Division. They're in second place in the Western Conference. When you start to break this team down and look at them, they had 3 losses in October, 3 losses in November, 2 losses in December, 3 losses in January, 3 in February, and then all of a sudden, March, they fell off a cliff. They have 4 losses in March with 5 games remaining. And obviously, a lot of that has to do with the injuries to, I suppose I could just say the name of any player on the Warriors at this point. Right. Kevin Durant, Steph Curry, Draymond Green took a knee to the groin last night in the Spurs game from Danny Green, and also Klay Thompson out with the broken thumb. So I feel like this is probably the place to start. Let's talk about these injuries. We can sort of unpack them individually or as a group, but I think the ultimate question here is how much of this is going to hang over into the playoffs, and how much will that matter for this Warriors squad?
So, Alex, this is the hard thing to me about evaluating probabilities, because in some situations we can say it's all about percentages. It's a make or miss league. This team's an underdog, but they have a 30% chance of winning because they could get hot from deep or something like that. But there are other situations, and I group this into the latter, where it's only one of two extremes that is actually true. So the two extremes here are either the Warriors are 100% healthy by the playoffs and they can't lose, or it'd be very hard to conceive of them losing, or they're not 100% and they're vulnerable. But we don't know which one it is right now. So we're applying our probability based on how likely it is that we think they're going to be healthy, right? It kind of reminds me of the Markelle Fultz situation, where if Markelle Fultz gets his jumper back, he's the number one talent from last year's draft still. If he doesn't, he's a bust. Because it seems maybe 50-50, maybe worse than that at this point, that's true. We apply those percentages, but we don't know, and we're just guessing. So the general vibe right now, at least coming out of the Warriors side, is that they're just doing the rest thing. Draymond said himself before he got hurt last night, although I think that he'll be, I don't think he's going to miss any time, but he said all three of those other guys, Steph, KD, and Klay, could be playing right now. And Steve Kerr said the same thing. If this was the playoffs, they'd be out there. But then you look at the injuries. I mean, you ran through them. Klay Thompson has a fractured shooting hand. I don't know if there's a worse player in the league to have a fractured shooting hand. Steph Curry's ankle problems that really hampered him early in his career may be coming back. And KD has a fractured rib, which, I mean, might be the least concerning of the three, but still, that doesn't sound like nothing. I mean, I think, to me, I would feel a lot more comfortable chalking this all up to rest if those guys had, quote unquote, sore shoulders or something like that.
Yeah, a couple things to unpack out of that for you. I fractured through when I was in high school, and it was incredibly painful. Yeah. So don't play that. But the question I think I have for you, and don't feel like I'm attacking you or anything like this, but this is a real question. Do you think, as someone who watches this team religiously, a healthy iteration of the Warriors is, when I say unbeatable, I mean in a series? Do you think that there is a realistic chance that a healthy Warriors can lose a series?
I do think there's absolutely a realistic chance of that. Yeah. I mean, and we can get into that more. We're going to talk about some of the dangers of the on-off switch, which to me is a big part of that. But just even if we ignore that from a talent standpoint, I always thought that this Houston team was going to be a threat, even from the moment they got Chris Paul. And a lot of people were wondering, is this going to work? To me, the Warriors have not been challenged by a backcourt throughout Steph and Klay's career, really, even back when Mark Jackson was in charge, that can match up with them in the sense that Steph Curry always gets to guard the worst of the opponent's two guards.
Right.
And against Houston, the worst of the two guards is Chris Paul. Now, I'm not saying Chris Paul is, going to put up 30 a night on Steph, because I think Steph is a capable defender and Chris Paul's not that type of player. But just by making him defend every possession, and by the way, Klay Thompson has always been the guy that guarded Chris Paul when he was with the Clippers, and that's limited Paul's effectiveness. If he's busy with Harden, I think that this is a different animal for this backcourt. Now, KD is obviously the X factor, and it's going to come down to how they defend him. But just from a backcourt matchup, I don't think the Warriors have ever faced anything like this. So I certainly wouldn't chalk it up to, a pre-foregone conclusion here.
Okay, so let's talk about these injuries, and then I do want to get into sort of taking apart the Western Conference and the matchups that lie ahead. But I want to touch back on this injury thing. You said Durant is out with a rib fracture. That seems pretty simple. That's pretty cut and dry. It is painful. It's painful to breathe, but at the end of the day, it's going to heal and he's going to be fine. Draymond, we don't really know what happened last night. It didn't look serious. I mean, he kind of caught right in the hip area.
Yeah, it seemed like he took a knee kind of to the groin, but like a bit up in the lower stomach area, maybe.
Yeah,
I don't know exactly what it is. I think it's probably some sort of deep bruise. I don't know if it's a bone bruise, but something along those lines would just be my dry read on it.
Yeah, I think it looked. I'm trying to look it up right now as we speak, but it seemed to me that it was not going to be a big deal. That they sort of held him out in a precautionary way, and so that's going to be fine. But the two injuries to me that really stand out, and you touched on one of them, is the broken right thumb for Klay Thompson, which. If you're a shooter, that your thumb is kind of the guide. You're using your thumb and your ring finger to kind of center the ball as you shoot. And that's a little bit worrisome for a guy who is probably the best catch and shoot player in the league, maybe one of the best catch and shoot players we've ever seen. So that's a really worrisome injury. But
Alex.
Oh, go ahead.
Touch on that really quick. You said you had a fractured rib in college. I had the injury Klay has, and it was crazy because I used to play a lot of basketball in college. I wish I was still doing that. But But I fractured my thumb on my left hand, so I was still out there playing, dependent on my right. The next time I was playing, I was so dependent on my right that I fractured my right thumb.
Did you have to wear 2 casts?
I did. It was awful. And so that's kind of, it's a funny story, but it kind of goes to why it's important for Klay to take the time to heal here. Now, because it's his right hand, there's not really a question. He just is going to be completely ineffective without that jumper. But it's important that he gets that to 100% because that is something where it can affect the way you play on the court.
And the projections that I've seen have him coming back in early April. It seems like an injury that will heal, that is not going to require a lot of rehab, not a lot to it. So that one, while concerning, I think the big concern is a re-injury at some point. Even with a heel, even with a fracture the way it is, a break can sort of reopen. And I think probably that's the biggest concern. I mean, if thumbs get caught in jerseys, guys grab hands, these kind of things happen. But ultimately, this feels like another injury where you just go, okay, this is one we can get past.
Sure.
But the big one, and the one that I'm not sure we can get past, is Steph Curry's ankle injury. This is number 4 this season. He's missed a number of games. I mean, I can look at what the exact number of games is because they played 71. And Steph Curry's played 50.
Yeah, 21 now, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So 21 games he's missed with this ankle injury. And, years and years ago, when the Golden State Warriors landed him with the 7th pick in the 2009 draft, maybe speaking out of turn there.
Yeah.
09, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so when they landed him with the 7th pick in the 09 draft, one of the reasons that he fell so far was his ankle injuries. And if you've heard the stories about how he trained his core and how he, sort of reinvented the way his body worked to downplay those ankle injuries. But here we are in season 10 for him, and the ankle injuries seem to be a problem again.
Yeah, so Steph, it was a huge problem for him early in his career. It was a concern going into the draft, and it became a lot more of a concern through his first couple seasons, especially in his third year, which was the lockout year. He only played in 23 of the 66 games that year, and they shut him down, partially for tanking reasons, but also because he just clearly needed some sort of more permanent surgical repair. And really ever since then, I mean, he had a couple tweaks the following year, 2012-13, but that's really been about it. He had the slight tweak in the beginning of the 2015-16 playoffs before he came back and sprained his MCL in his game back. But he's been almost an Iron Man for this team since that lockout season. And this is bringing back a lot of bad memories for I'm sure Curry and all people that follow the Warriors.
Yeah, when you look at his game totals since that lockout season, since that 23-game season, 78, 78, 80, 79, 79. So besides, those are 2 and 3 games that you can sort of attribute to rest. You're totally right. Now, how much of a concern is this? I mean, you'll never catch Steve Kerr in a candid moment about this. You'll never catch Bob Myers in a candid moment about this. How much of a real concern is this behind the scenes for the Warriors, do you think?
I think it's a real concern because with the ankle injury, again, the more it's rolled, the more susceptible it is. Now, granted, it's great that they're giving him the time right now to, make sure he's more than 100%, whatever it is, because they weren't necessarily doing that with the couple rolls he suffered in February and March. Given that, just the fact that this problem has returned, and the first one was way back in December, and he looked great for a month, and then it came back again. So even if it's the kind of thing he can play through and they're minor and they're being overly cautious right now, you tweak an ankle midway through a matchup with Houston, let's say, I mean, that could swing the series. Even if he just misses one game, that could be the game, because we all know that Stephen Curry is what makes this team the team it is. So I don't think any sort of missed time from a player of Steph's magnitude can ever be chalked up to a minor thing.
There's a rabbit hole that I kind of want to pursue here based off something you said. And I feel like people don't recognize how important Steph Curry is. Steph Curry has the most gravity of any player in the NBA. And when I say that, I mean he warps defenses the most, particularly in pick and rolls. They sort of have to accommodate him and hedge him and help on him. And that gravity is what helps the Warriors offense be as fluid as it is. And obviously, you have two scorers with Durant and Curry, and then you have Thompson, who's a great catch and shoot player. But you have two players who can create their own shot in a very effective way. And with that gravity missing, the Warriors lose a lot of their punch. I mean, do you think this is a team, if there is a significant concern, do you think this is a team that is still capable of winning the Western Conference, or does, if Steph Curry misses significant time, is that off the table for this team?
So I'll put it this way. If the roles were flipped and it was Kevin Durant that was out instead of Steph Curry, let's just say theoretically, KD misses significant playoff time, I think that the Warriors are still the favorites in the West. Not only possible, but I think they're still the favorites.
Okay.
You flip that, they're nothing close to the favorites. I still think they can come out of the West with that team just because the defense is still going to be elite, probably even better without Steph, although Steph does play a role in that defense. And I think there's enough talent, Kevin Durant has enough singular talent to still rise up to be the best player in the postseason. And he's got two other All-Stars next to him. That being said, this team does not look anything like the team it is with Steph Curry on the floor when he's off the floor. And Houston, by contrast, always has an elite offense. They stagger Chris Paul and James Harden in a way that gives them that elite unit. Kevin Durant, without Steph Curry, the Warriors are, I think, last time I checked, it was a couple days ago, but their offensive rating was 109.5 with KD out there and no Steph. That's 123.4 when you add Steph, and it stays at 119.4 when Durant is off with Curry on. So the offense falls off significantly, and the defensive change is not as dramatic. Like you said about Steph's gravity, I think what people underrate about the gravity, it's not just that, okay, Steph draws so much defensive attention that he's creating openings elsewhere, but it's the fact that he can do that on or off ball. Whereas
Right.
you have guys in the league like, even James Harden, who is a fantastic shooter, wherever he may be, he just isn't active off ball. He's not the screener that Steph Curry is. Defenses don't freak out the same way. Yeah, they know James Harden's a, high 30s, low 40s% 3-point shooter, but they kind of treat him like that. The way people defend Steph Curry, they treat him like he's an 80% 3-point shooter. They will actually abandon the hoop for a wide open dunk to take away a Steph Curry 3, which percentage-wise makes absolutely no sense. But he's just a singular force in the league that people view that way, and that's his greatest value of all, probably.
I think that probably is a organizational success as much as it is a Steph Curry success. The amount of movement when you watch games, and I watch a fair bit of NBA games, but recently I've been watching a lot of NCAA games. Scouting for the 94 Feet Report, doing our draft guide, that kind of thing. And I have noticed that one of the flaws in the college game is there's not a lot of side-to-side action. You see a lot of straightforward. You see a little bit of pick and roll, certainly not at the level you see in the NBA. But when you watch a Warriors game, you see 3 and 4 people moving at a time, and the 2 people who aren't moving are screening. This is a team that has dedicated itself to motion, and whether Steph Curry has the ball or Durant or they even use Livingston in a creator role from time to time, who is a very effective passer, or David West is a great high post passer. This is a team that sort of prides itself on being able to move the ball in a very, very efficient fashion.
Yeah, like you said, the movement is huge. There's always guys moving, and the screening, and that's what I think also makes Steph stand out, is just his willingness to do things that don't necessarily directly translate to his own numbers. He's completely willing to set a screen. Now, a lot of times it is a decoy to get himself open, but that's still work that a lot of guys don't want to do. A lot of guys would just rather kind of, go up to the top of the arc and get the ball and go to work. But he'll also set screens to free up teammates, and he's the smallest guy on the court, and it speaks to the added strength we talked about earlier. Not only has it kept him healthier, but it's just made him a more complete basketball player. The Warriors right now, they miss Steph's offensive rebounding. I don't know if they ended with 0 rebounds last night. I know they had 0 late into that Spurs game, which was going to be like the 3rd time in NBA history a team had no offensive boards. Steph Curry is a huge part of that, because the Warriors have gotten big men like Zaza Pachulia, like David West, who just box out. They're not going to go up and sky for a ball, but they allow guards to sneak in and grab the boards. And Steph has become one of the best players in the league at that. He takes charges. He competes on defense. He's physical. So he's just a complete basketball player, and really so much more than just kind of this shooter or scorer even that he gets credit for being.
How much do you think the unanimous MVP season works against Steph Curry? I, just from a fan perspective, just from people who watch the game, I feel like there was a lot of pushback. And, Ryan Russillo, Zach Lowe, others have said that they don't believe that there's a chance that Steph Curry will win another MVP just because of the pushback from that season. How much do you think that perception works against him on a night-to-night basis for fans?
I think that a lot of people that season, they were in their minds fooled by Steph Curry. So they decided that, okay, this guy, he is the best player in the league. He's better than LeBron James. He's the most dominant force in the league. And once the finals came around and they saw that LeBron was still that guy, whether or not Steph Curry's injury played a role in that, Steph clearly was underwhelming in the finals in a way that, even you figure a 70% or 50%, whatever he may be, LeBron James would not have been. Just his decision-making and his inability to, what losing that burst took away from his game exposed some of his deficiencies. Now, that being said, I think people went too far with it, where they felt tricked by Curry. They felt maybe a little embarrassed that they had considered him to be so good. It's like, oh, of course, I'm silly me for thinking that a little guy could actually be this dominant. And they decided that Curry was vastly overrated based on that. And then the following season, you had another point guard in Russell Westbrook, but who was so much more physically dominant, that kind of just fit that mold of, okay, this is what a basketball player is. This is what an MVP is. Steph Curry is a great shooter. He was really hot that season, but clearly it's not something sustainable. And I don't know how he shakes that perception as long as Kevin Durant's on his team, frankly, because I personally think Curry was the best player in last year's finals. I think if you watch that series, yes, Durant shot I think 69 true shooting in the series. He averaged 35 points. Pretty much every time he got the ball, he was facing a mismatch because Steph Curry had just gotten double teamed or had the best guy on him and found KD. So he's a major, major beneficiary of what Steph does, but it still feeds the perception that he is the best player on the team. And Steph was willing to make that trade-off when he recruited KD to come there. I guess he's okay with, winning more titles versus being seen in that light again. I don't blame him, but I think that is his new reality, and I agree. I don't see him winning another MVP.
Yeah, it's very strange to me how quickly narratives can change. He became, this babyface assassin when he was first in the league, and people really loved him. And there was a lot of joy around this Warriors team, particularly pre-first title. But I think some of the fatigue of them being so good for so long, and maybe Curry's personality or something, the mouthpiece. My brother uses mouthpiece. That's just a thing that there has been a lot of vitriol aimed at Steph Curry, particularly since the 73-9 unanimous MVP season. And it's interesting to see how NBA Twitter fans in general just sort of turn on Curry like that.
Yeah, I think there was, like you said, a turning on Curry, and there's definitely some disdain for him. I also do think that there's a disconnect where people acknowledge how important he is to the Warriors, but then we'll turn around and say, but Kevin Durant's a better player, but, James Harden might be a better player. Steph is not seen as that, force up there with LeBron James. To me, that doesn't really make any sense. I think that if a guy is clearly so much more impactful towards his team winning or losing, I think that's the goal of basketball, and I think he's a better basketball player. Now, I understand the argument that he's not that kind of defensive player, so he doesn't seem like as much of a well-rounded player. My counter argument is, first of all, offense matters more than defense for individual players.
Absolutely.
By a considerable margin. And secondly, when you are that much of an offensive force, maybe the most game-altering offensive force we've ever seen, that's enough to compensate for whatever those shortcomings may be. So to me, Steph Curry is still the second best player in the NBA. And we'll see from LeBron James this postseason if he is still that guy that can really turn it up. But I think Curry has as good a case as anyone as the next guy.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like I said, I don't know where it came from, but it certainly is a perception that has cropped up in the past few years. Now, I do want to shift gears a little bit and talk about there are some interesting things going on. And it started with Steve Kerr at the beginning of the year, and he sort of made this blanket statement that climbing the mountain the second time, the third time is difficult. And maybe you feel like this team's played 300 games in the past 3 years, and that's quite a bit. But Steve Kerr sort of handicapped this regular season by saying how difficult it was to repeat, and he had been there before and all these things. And to me, that's sort of setting the bar a little bit lower. And maybe that's on purpose. Steve Kerr is a very calculated man. He knows what he's saying. Maybe he did value the rest that they're going to get. But to me, it feels like this team takes games off, even when they're totally healthy. And last night, basically the Santa Cruz Warriors lost to San Antonio. The lowest amount of points in team history, but you can't really, I guess you can't really take that as a full Warriors roster. But there are losses when you look back over the past couple of months where it just looks like they took nights off. Now, is that an accurate perception, or am I maybe skewing things a little bit?
So I don't think the Warriors have ever come out this season and decided to take a night off, but I think there's been a growing trend since the 2015-16 season when they won 73 games and just were, not only one of the best teams of all time, but one of the hardest competing regular season teams of all time. And it was that combination, as well as some spectacular clutch play, that got them the wins record. That being said, since then, they learned their lesson. Obviously, that postseason, they faced injury problems. They wore down in the finals, and they paced themselves a lot more last year. Last year, it really only showed up in clutch time. So they were still a 67-win team, and they had I think a better point differential than that. But they weren't very good in the clutch, whereas they had been amazing in the clutch the previous year. This year, it's kind of trickled over into the start of games. So the Warriors will come out flat a lot, and then they'll flip the switch in the third quarter. But a lot of times they'll be down too much for it to even matter, or they'll flip the switch, but then they'll turn it back off. And, because of the early work the opponent did, they'll still lose the game. So there clearly is less intensity than there has been. And that's been a trend year to year. And I think that'll just continue. The question obviously is it worth it? And we'll see. But I think Steve Kerr, like you said, is a very perceptive guy and made the calculation that he thinks it is. So I think that's where they're at. And again, we'll see. But right now, with these guys resting, that goes to that same mentality, right? Maybe these guys would have played through these injuries in years past, and that's just not the mindset anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something to even be said where if you look back at the 73-9 season, that was a team that was so dedicated to doing what they did in the regular season that it almost felt like they ran out of gas a little bit. I recently watched Game 7 of the NBA Finals of that year, and it just felt like there was a little bit of maybe emotional fatigue is the way to go. They were just sort of worn out, and LeBron is such a force to be reckoned with, particularly he and Kyrie together in that NBA Finals, that it felt like he sort of drug them into the series that he wanted and wore them down. But to me, as I watched it, I thought, this is a tired team, and so maybe in changing gears in the 18 losses, which will probably be more like 21 or 22 by the time the season's over, you have more rest, you have more time for these guys to sort of rest and recuperate, because this is a roster that's getting up there, not just in years, but in games played over the past 4 seasons.
Yeah, it is the games played. And like you said, though, it's also the age. I mean, so the Warriors' depth has been largely criticized this season. And that's another thing where we're going to have to wait and see, because their most crucial bench player is still Andre Iguodala. It always has been. And hopefully it always will be, for the duration of his new contract, which goes 3 seasons. Iguodala, people think that he's falling off. That's been a common perception. If you compare his numbers to last year, they're pretty in line. The shooting has dropped off a little, but he's just chilled during the regular season, and we saw him crank it up last postseason. We've seen him do that before. So a lot of this is just a matter of the team's getting older. They're also getting wiser. And we're really not going to know until the postseason whether or not what we've seen this regular season was an omen, a sign of this decline, or if it's just the new phase of this Warriors team.
And I mean, and honestly, that's fair. Like as the team starts to age, maybe this is the right way to go about that, because you just start talking about the mileage that these guys have put on, and when you stretch it back, like playing in the summer, playing with the Olympics, and a lot of the Warriors guys have stopped doing that, but when the odometer starts to read 400 games in 4 years, that's a hell of a lot of basketball to be played. And basketball is one of these games where your injuries start to you're hurt first, your ankle's sore when you wake up in the morning, and then 5 more games go by and it's a little more sore, and they start to compound and sort of snowball. And maybe that's what we've seen with Steph Curry, but I honestly think when you look at a roster that includes David West, that includes Sean Livingston, Andre Iguodala, this is a team that probably needs the rest. Now, fairly decent young contributors in Jordan Bell, Patrick McCall, Kevin Looney, like they're good players who are younger, but like you said, Iguodala is the linchpin of making this team go and making that lineup that has been so effective in years past with Curry, with the 4 All-Stars. I mean, right. Curry, Thompson, and Green, and then throw Iguodala in there. This is the lineup that's been most effective, and maybe Jordan Bell steps in at some point and takes over that spot. Maybe he doesn't, but preserving the longevity of this seems to be like the ultimate goal, and to me, that seems to be the smartest goal.
Yeah, there is a flip side though, and I agree. It probably is the smartest. The flip side, of course, is that you do develop habits during the regular season. And there are a lot of people who aren't worried about this. People talk about flipping the switch, and that's a thing that we've seen teams do. We've seen the Cavs do it with, especially playing in the Eastern Conference, their ability to just be sure that they could take off most of the regular season, especially LeBron, who has, more miles on him than anybody, and just be able to be the same players, if not better, during the playoffs because they're fresh. But we also saw something from those Cavs teams, which was that when it got to the finals against the Warriors, and I say this past tense because I don't think they're getting back there this year, Cleveland, but when they would get to the finals, they would kind of revert to some of the bad habits they formed during the regular season. They would botch switches, they would struggle to properly match up in transition. Of course, the Warriors bring that out in a lot of teams, but if you have developed the deep-rooted habits during the season to, cope with stuff like that, I think they'd be in a better place to do so, and they just weren't. Now, that's where I get worried about this Golden State team, because can they flip the switch in the first round against, Denver? Or, I mean, I don't think Denver's actually going to make the playoffs, but whoever they may face, yes. Can they do it in the second round against a Portland? Yes. But when they get to play Houston, who not only has 2 top 10 NBA players on their roster, but also has developed those kind of habits in much more thoroughly this season than the Warriors have, that's where it starts to get a little dicey, and where there might be a little more to this, this regular season thing than people are thinking.
So that brings up an interesting question, and you've touched on the Rockets quite a bit, but I think there are a number of other teams that present a little bit of a problem in sort of different ways. And right now, if you look at the standings at this moment, one of those teams is the Oklahoma City Thunder. However, they would be on the other side of the bracket from Golden State. They're at the 4 seed right now. But I think the Oklahoma City Thunder, and I try not to let recency bias be a part of this, but I think that the Oklahoma City Thunder have been successful against the Warriors this season. Now, some of that's injury related and some of that is switch related. So you have to wonder how much effort they've really given in these games and whatnot. But the player that actually kills the Warriors is Steven Adams. And Steven Adams is an incredibly effective screener. He's a huge guy. He's a great offensive rebounder. And we saw the Cavaliers a couple of seasons ago sort of dedicate a lot of time to out-rebounding the Warriors, and that became a big factor And I think that hole is still there. And Steven Adams has been one of the best at sort of exploiting that. The Thunder, with all the baggage, with all the things that go on between KD and Westbrook, I mean, I feel like we put this to bed, but do you feel like the Thunder present a problem?
So you bring up a great point with Adams, because I was ready to just give you some Russell Westbrook stats here, and I'm still going to do it just because I love to,
okay,
put on Russell Westbrook at any opportunity I have. So the Warriors just know how to contain him and make him extremely inefficient. For all of the success that OKC has had against the Warriors this year, they're 2-1. Westbrook's true shooting was still only 54%, 44% from the field. Last year, he shot 37.5% from the field against this Golden State team. And if you want to chalk that up to him maybe overcompensating because of the KD matchup and all that, the year before, when KD was still on his side, he shot 34.7% from the field against the Warriors, 43.8% true shooting. And in that postseason series, in those Western Conference Finals, he was still sub 40%, 39% from the field, 4.4 turnovers. The Warriors just know how to make him inefficient, make him a volume shooter. And because of that, I just don't see how this team could win. Steven Adams presents a major problem. That's a great point. And Paul George does too. But if you're talking about the Thunder, it needs to start with Russell Westbrook. He is the engine there. And if the Warriors are able to turn off that engine, I just don't think that this team presents any real challenge to them, especially now with Andre Robertson not there for the defense and Carmelo Anthony kind of presenting this conundrum, especially when you face a team like Golden State who can just exploit bad defenders better than anyone else.
No, I agree with you, except for I would probably take it the other way. Instead of saying they turn off the engine, what they do to Russell Westbrook is turn the engine into overdrive, right. Which turns out to be, just as effective a strategy when you have Russ going 4 for 17 from 3. That tends to work out pretty well.
Yeah.
But that to me is the team that I probably worry about the most outside of Houston because of Steven Adams. Because Steven Adams is not a guy that you can catch in pick and rolls and really exploit like a Zaza Pachulia, like other big players who sort of get played out of the playoffs. We saw it with Enes Kanter last year. He's a guy who can stay on the court, who can stay effective, and is one of, if not the best offensive rebounders in the league. And that's an area where they can beat the Thunder. But like you said, there are a lot of reasons why with Robertson's injury being the main one that this team can't hang around. But the other team that I wanted to bring up, and again, this is probably just me grasping at straws, but it is something I wanted to talk about, is right now the 7 seed is the New Orleans Pelicans. Now, the Pelicans don't have a very good roster. I don't think. I think they're kind of Anthony Davis and friends, but Anthony Davis has exploded onto the scene. And obviously this was a team that was much more dangerous with DeMarcus Cousins, but it feels like Davis was in 5th gear, and now he's in like 8th gear. How much of a threat is Anthony Davis and friends to the Warriors? I mean, is this something that could they take a game? I'm not saying can they win the series. I'm saying can Anthony Davis take a game?
Well, we almost saw Anthony Davis take a game back in this team's matchup in 2015. New Orleans was up 20 points in the 4th quarter in Game 3 before Steph Curry hit his famous corner 3 that should have been a 4-point play to tie it. So, we've seen what AD can do on the playoff stage. Now, he still is yet to win a playoff game. That was his only appearance, and he hasn't been back to the postseason since then. Obviously, this is a different Warriors animal with Durant now, but it's certainly a different Pelicans animal simply due to AD being a more complete, stronger, dominant player than he's ever been before. So I wouldn't put it past New Orleans to take Game 3 or Game 4 at all. Now, if DeMarcus Cousins was there, then you're talking about them actually making it a series. Again, not one I think they could win, but you're talking about maybe a Game 6 and pushing maybe to a Game 7 if everything goes right. It really is a shame that he's out, though, because that whoever New Orleans matched up against in the first round, I would have loved to see if those two guys in the playoffs were just too much to handle for someone.
That was going to be a very difficult thing. And obviously injuries have robbed us of a lot of things this season with, Kristaps Porzingis being out, with Gordon Hayward going out in the first game of the season. Injuries have been the foe to many NBA fans. Let's talk about the Eastern Conference for a second. I'm gonna cut out 12 of the teams and say of the three Eastern Conference.
You're telling me that Brooklyn doesn't pose a threat?
I'm telling you that not only Brooklyn, I'll go as far as to say Milwaukee, Miami, Philadelphia, Washington, and sorry, Pacers fans, but Indiana. Let's talk about the Raptors, the Celtics, and the Cavaliers. Which of these teams presents the biggest problem to the Warriors in a presumed NBA Finals matchup?
I think the obvious answer is Cleveland, but I'm not going with that one. The Cavs have never really seemed like a threat to me for the Warriors, outside of 3 games in the 2016 Finals, which were a very fateful 3 games. But even
and I mean, like, sorry to cut you off there, but to me, there's this really huge distinction in the Kyrie era versus the post-Kyrie era.
Yeah.
Their guard play is a mess with the way they've been playing lately. I mean, they're 5-5 over their past 10. They have not looked great, even after the trade deadline, even after this revamping. Their guard play is a mess. They can't defend anybody. Obviously, they still have the best player on the planet in LeBron James. But no, I'm totally with you. Without Kyrie Irving, that secondary player that the Warriors had so much trouble handling, I just don't see this team as a legitimate threat.
And not only did Cleveland lose that guy that was the secondary player that clearly made the difference in those 2016 Finals, but the Warriors swapped out Harrison Barnes, who I think that's the most completely forgotten plot point of that series. Everyone talks about Kyrie's shot, LeBron's block, Steph's behind the back pass, or Kevin Love, quote unquote, shutting him down, the Draymond suspension, Iguodala's back injury, whatever it may be. No one talks about Harrison Barnes, who, if he had shot 25% from the field over those 3 games, the Warriors would be champs. He shot 15% in games 5, 6, and 7. He was 5 for 32 from the field. And then they swapped that guy out for Kevin Durant. So I just don't think Cleveland has ever been a real threat to them since then. Now, where I would want to go, but I guess I'll do process of elimination here, and you'll know where I'm going to end up. I don't think Toronto's a threat either. The Warriors have played some tough games against the Raptors over the last couple of seasons, and I do think DeMar DeRozan is a different player than he's been. I think the Raptors are going to be a much better postseason team than they have been, and I could definitely see them making the finals. That being said, I still don't like the matchup for them against Golden State. Because
Agreed.
The fact of the matter is Kyle Lowry's not the same guy he used to be. Steph Curry will be able to kind of get that rest that I was talking about earlier that's so important. Although Lowry's a physical guy, he's just not getting that kind of usage anymore. And if he is, you're taking the ball out of DeRozan's hands. And Klay Thompson is a perfect defender against DeMar DeRozan. He's the only 2 guard in the league that matches his length and physicality. And look, if Klay doesn't take him all game, then you throw Kevin Durant on him. Then you throw Andre Iguodala on him. The Warriors just have Draymond Green, even the Warriors have too many bodies to throw at the focal point of that offense for me to really be too worried about it.
Well, and I think there's a secondary problem. I did some extensive Raptors study last week. I did a podcast with our own Levi Pitts of the 94 Feet Report, and we talked about the Raptors extensively. And one of the conclusions that I came to is there aren't a ton of LeBron stoppers. Now, you can flip that over and talk about Durant sort of in the same vein, but they have guys that I'm not 100% confident you can keep Giannis Valanciunas on the floor in critical playoff games. And then that leaves you with Serge Ibaka. And then, Pascal Siakam is maybe a guy who can play some minutes on Durant, but then OG Anunoby is going to be your feature defender. And I think that's sort of where you run into the issue is when you start to look at the matchups with Toronto and Golden State, it looks like there's a mismatch in one place or another. And Lowry's a fine defender. I think DeMar DeRozan's a little bit of an underrated defender. But when you start to compare who's going to guard Draymond, who's going to guard Iguodala, who's going to guard, when you start to match them up in the actual on-court minutes, outside of the Warriors getting rolled by the Toronto's really extremely effective bench. And I think that's where in the last 6 minutes of the second quarter and the first 6 minutes of the third quarter is where Toronto really has an advantage. But outside of that, I see a lot of holes for this team, this much improved Toronto team, but I still don't think they're quite there yet.
I completely agree with that. And you bring up Valanciunas. I don't see any way he could stay on the floor. Like Steven Adams earlier, he's a great offensive rebounder and, offensive player, but unlike Steven Adams, he doesn't bring it on the defensive end. So then you're talking about going to a lesser player who might be a better matchup, like a Jakob Poeltl or a Pascal Siakam at the 5. You could put a Ibaka at the 5, but then you lose the size advantage that Toronto may otherwise have over this team. So it would be very tough to see them matching up over the course of a playoff series.
And that's a great point. Yeah, that's a great point because the Warriors have created. I mean, the Warriors have obviously shifted the dynamic of the entire league and how people defend, and there's just a number of things that they've changed about the league. But the Warriors drag you into this down and dirty game when it gets into playoff series. They drag you into this down and dirty game of you have to meet them at their strength. They refuse to play bigs when it matters. Now we'll talk about this in a minute, but
yeah, I'm sure
there are still some moments where I see bigs on the floor and I'm like, what are we doing here? But the Warriors, when it really gets to the point where it matters, they drag you into a game where you can't play your 5 best players. And now teams around the league, particularly the Houston Rockets, have taken steps to sort of counteract Golden State's ability. But I think fighting a pig in the mud is essentially what you get into with Golden State because they want to do things a certain way and they force you to answer.
And that's why we saw that Thunder team almost beat them. I mean, that was the one team that was just completely resistant to that and played their size. The reason they were able to do that, again, Steven Adams and Serge Ibaka at the 4 and Kevin Durant at the 3. None of those things are possible in a matchup with Toronto. But that is why I do think in a kind of roundabout way, I think Boston does pose the biggest threat to this team. Now, Boston certainly can't beat them with size in the way of those teams. In fact, Boston may not even have any sort of rebounding advantage against this Golden State team unless it just wants to, go all out with Aaron Baines, Greg Monroe minutes, which I don't think it will. But Boston, kind of like Houston, is built to play small with this team. Al Horford is a perfect antidote to Draymond Green on defense and on both ends of the court, really. And then they have the wings to match up. I mean, in the game that Golden State played at Boston back in November, when I thought the Warriors would go in there and break Boston's winning streak, and it looked like it was going to happen until Boston, I think, had 2 16-point comebacks in that game. You probably remember that as well as I do. I saw a great, and this is what Brad Stevens has always done against the Warriors. Basically, he's said, I'm going to throw my best defenders on Steph Curry. And that made a lot of sense, back when he had Avery Bradley on the team, especially. But I'm just going to hound Curry all over the court. I'm going to be super physical with him off ball. I'm going to make other guys beat me. And Kevin Durant is a guy that can certainly beat anyone when you play that way. But Boston at least has the guys to match up decently with Durant. I think Durant had decent efficiency numbers in those games. But if you just let Durant get his shots, and this goes back to why I think Curry's a more valuable player than Durant. Durant getting his shots is something you can isolate as a defense. You can give it to him, even if he's super efficient on those shots, that's 20 shots out of however many they take in the game, 80, whatever it may be. If you have Curry making decisions and having, isolations, the ball in his hands, that's when things start breaking down and there are breakdowns. And I think the Celtics have the ability to take that away. Now, obviously, this is with the caveat that will Marcus Smart be back by that time?
Yeah, exactly. That was the point that I was getting ready to bring up. Is to me, there's no real question whether the Warriors can beat a Marcus Smartless Warriors because a Celtics team. Because when you look at it, you have this sharp juxtaposition that Marcus Smart played in the first game against the Warriors and was incredibly effective at dogging Curry's steps and making him play inefficiently. And then in the second game, he was not there. He did not play, and Curry had a field day. So you see that juxtaposition in the way that the Warriors can be effective against Marcus Smart. They have to go about it one way, and then without Marcus Smart, they can go about it the way that they want to. And to me, that's a really huge thing. Now, Smart, it looks like he's going to be healthy. He says he's going to be healthy, however you take that. But outside of Smart, you've got Jason Tatum, who is, I think, 12 years old, if you ask everybody on NBA Twitter, but has played incredibly effectively and is really starting to grow into himself. You got Jaylen Brown, who's a pretty capable defender. But the side effect of the Celtics building to beat the Cavaliers is they have a lot of LeBron stoppers, and those guys turn out to be, and I say that in air quotes because if you listen to the show a lot, I hate that phrase, but they have a lot of guys who lot of wing guys, a lot of guys that are effective in the modern NBA. They've got Marcus Morris, they've got Jaylen Brown, they got Jason Tatum, they got Gordon Hayward. What? But they have built a team around the ability to be flexible, to play defense, and then they have this singular engine in Kyrie Irving, who has proven to be a difficult matchup for the Warriors now, which is not to say that they can't figure out a way to do it, just that it is a little bit more difficult for them to match up with him because of his quickness, because of his ability to get to the rim. He's a difficult player to guard for anybody, but the Warriors, it's shown up a little bit more even over the past couple of seasons.
Well, I think the Warriors, I think Irving, like you said, is a difficult matchup for everybody. And I actually think the Warriors in some ways have a perfect guy to guard him in Klay Thompson. The thing is, we've seen it in the finals. There's just nothing Klay can do when Irving gets into one of his zones. What Klay is able to do is force Kyrie to make difficult shots.
Right.
And if you're giving Kyrie easy shots, you're really in trouble because he's a knockdown shooter. He's a great finisher at the rim. He can shoot from everywhere. We know what Kyrie can do when it's easy for him. And Klay makes it hard on him. But maybe better than any other player in the league, Kyrie can transcend that and still have these crazy efficient games. Whereas I brought it up earlier with Russell Westbrook, the subtext there, to what the Warriors do against him is they put Klay Thompson on him and make him inefficient. That doesn't work against Kyrie, certainly not when he gets into one of those zones. You can look at the box score and say, oh my God, the Warriors didn't defend him at all tonight. He was, 14 of 21 or something. And then you watch the game and it seemed like Klay was all over him. So having that ability on the Celtics side now, which used to be on the Cavs side, gives Boston, I think, a real chance against this team. Of course, what it comes down to is what is the likelihood that, Kyrie has 4, or, more realistically, he's going to need 5 or 6 because they're not going to win every game where he's good. But Kyrie having those kind of games consistently versus, like I said, if Boston deploys the same strategy that they always have against the Warriors, it's going to be Durant getting those shots. And what's the probability of that happening? And Boston not hearing from Curry, even with great defense, are they going to be able to not hear from him all series?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of issues, not the least of which is the Celtics are missing one of their key players, a guy that they dedicated a lot of their salary cap to, in Gordon Hayward. There are a lot of things about this team that make it difficult to see that happening. However, I think there's this one magic threshold that that's the series I want to see, not because I'm a Celtics fan, but to me, the Brad Stevens, Steve Kerr matchup is interesting. The Kyrie versus Golden State defense. There are a lot of little things that make that so interesting to me outside of my Celtic fandom. But the magic number in this series for me is 100. And when I say that, I mean, if the Celtics can play Golden State to games that end up under 100 points, they have a distinct advantage. The Celtics are not going to score 120 to beat the Warriors. But if they can play these games in, there's 3 minutes left in the game and it's 91-87, the Celtics have a distinct advantage in the way that they have created this machine that sort of grinds you over time. So that will be interesting to see which team can sort of impose their will, if that is indeed a finals matchup that we run into. Now, there are a lot of hurdles for the Celtics to clear, which I will get into in the coming weeks, because I'm not 100% sure this Celtics team is quite where they want to be at this stage of the game. But I definitely think that of the 3 teams in the East, that's probably the most difficult. Now, we've got just a few minutes left here, and I know that you and I have both been excited about this. I have 2 hot takes.
I'm very excited for this.
So I'm going to throw them out there, and I'm going to let you shoot them down, because I obviously don't watch the Warriors as often as you do. I watch a lot of basketball, but I can't obviously say that I'm watching the number of games that you are. And so I'm going to trust you as sort of the expert to disprove these 2 things. So the first thing is, I don't think Steve Kerr is a very good rotation coach. I think he's I think he's sort of a Phil Jackson protege in that he keeps people's minds right. I mean, you saw there was a clip the other night where he sort of sorted out a dispute between Nick Young and Quinn Cook. He's a guy who keeps people mentally fresh. They keeps them aware. Honestly, he lets them coach the game sometimes, but to me, and the big one is anytime I see Zaza Pachulia playing in the second half of a playoff game, I just stop and I go, what is going on here? Pachulia is not an effective player. I mean, the numbers sort of bear that out in a different way than traditionally, but I just don't think he's the type of player that helps the Warriors maximize their ability to win games in a small ball scenarios.
There is this weird dichotomy with Steve Kerr between being a traditionalist and, a progressive coach. I mean, so Steve Kerr's first move when he took over the Warriors, his first meaningful move was to go to Andre Iguodala and tell him, you're coming off the bench. That is not a conservative move by any stretch, right? And then when push came to shove in the finals and, he was facing problems with having a traditional center out there, he brought Iguodala back into the starting lineup and sent Andrew Bogut to the bench. Bogut played 10 minutes the rest of that series in 2015. And also, I should make the point, going back 2 rounds prior to that, the Warriors found themselves down 2-1 against Memphis, getting beasted by their traditional size. And Kerr made a really gutsy adjustment at the time. That's now a pretty common defensive strategy, but he just decided to essentially guard Tony Allen with Andrew Bogut, which really meant just keeping Bogut in the paint and letting Allen shoot as many threes as he wanted or try to, attack off the dribble. So Kerr has definitely made gutsy moves. At the same time, you brought it up, sometimes he just seems to feel like he needs to play traditional size in traditional ways. And the worst example, really, I mean, there were some Zaza examples, but last year's team rolled to 16-1 in the championship. But it was Game 7 of the 2016 finals when, now granted, Iguodala wasn't 100% at all, and Bogut was injured. So he didn't have the same options he normally had, but it was the fourth quarter of Game 7, and he had Festus Ezeli out there. And the Warriors were up, I believe, 67-63 at the time. One possession, LeBron gets switched onto Ezeli and draws a 3-shot foul, makes all 3. The next possession, he hits a 3 over Ezeli. And just like that, the Cavs are up 2. And that's 6 points in what ended up as a 4-point game. A quarter earlier, he had Anderson Varejao on the court. It's hard for me to think about those moments. But so there was it was a weird disconnect trying to, assess it from a Warriors perspective. Like, why is Kerr so reliant? This is the guy who went to Draymond at center a year ago in his starting lineup, but he's relying on these extremely, suboptimal, subpar bigs now. I think he did learn from that, and I don't think we've seen him in a situation where, if a series was on the line, I highly doubt he would have Zaza Pachulia out there, but he's still conservative in nature. And he's still going to wait until that adverse moment hits, at least, I think, before he makes a change. We saw it also with the Steph Curry, Kevin Durant pick and roll that people clamored for all year, all postseason last year, all finals. And he didn't break it out until the Warriors were in what he considered a must-win game, which was Game 5, and it was completely unstoppable. So Kerr's not afraid to make these changes, but he's going to wait until his team's back is against the wall before he does.
It's funny that you brought up that example because I was hoping that the way you would go about this was refuting Zaza first, and then I was going to bring up Festus Ezeli because it's, as I said, I watched Game 7, and the Cavaliers hunted those switches. Now, you said that he got switched onto Ezeli, but I feel like that may be sort of downplaying the way that LeBron went about this. When you watch those games, both when Varejao is in the game and then again when Ezeli's in the game, they hunted out those switches and they worked incredibly, incredibly hard to put LeBron in a position where he could get those. And then when he did, he obviously made them pay to the point where they end up winning Game 7. But it was in those small moments where I started to wonder, even at the time, I was sort of a little bit concerned about the way they had gone about that and playing that traditional size, because that was going to be my next example. So you sort of beat me to the punch on that.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't seen it from Kerr, right? That was the most recent situation, at least, where his team was really up against the wall and he made some bad decisions in that game. But, like I said, there were also the 2 series the year prior where I think he made some more proactive decisions once they got down 2-1. And I think what also makes it so difficult about that 2016 series is the Warriors were so dominant that year, and they had just been able to handle every situation. And that Game 7 really crept up on them. It wasn't like Cleveland went up 3-1, so Kerr had to make this lineup adjustment. It was like the Warriors were up 3-1. Game 5, I think a lot of people wrote off as Draymond being suspended. Game 6 was back in Cleveland. I think there was still a feeling that, okay, we're going to be fine in Game 7. And now Kerr as the coach, that's probably a knock against him that he didn't pick up on how dire that situation might have been. But I do think he learned from it. At the same time, we just have to see it, because we haven't seen him faced with, okay, do I just go to my optimal lineup here, forget minutes, forget getting people involved, whatever it may be? Do I just throw it out there when our team is on the line? And I'd love to see how he handles that, particularly against a team like Houston, who's going to present a lot of matchup problems.
Well, hopefully we're going to get to see that pretty soon. I, for one, with no rooting interest in the Western Conference, am for an all-out war when it comes to every round of the Western Conference playoffs, because I really want to see the push comes to shove how these teams sort of react to one another, particularly the Rockets and the Warriors. But even throw in the Spurs, the Thunder, there are other teams the Jazz, who are a terrifying team at the moment. But my last point, just sort of briefly here, I said this in our Slack a couple of months ago, and it set off a near riot amongst our writers.
Which I wasn't too directly involved with, I have to say.
Yeah, true, you weren't. It was a lot of other people sort of refuting this, but the more I watch, the more I stand by this. I think Draymond Green is past his peak. Now, I'm going to say this, and I'm going to apologize to all the listeners. I had a bunch of synergy stats ready to go on this one, and then for some reason I can't get into synergy right now. So a lot of my argument was based on stats that aren't available to me at the moment. However, I do have a few little nuggets. He's not been as effective a rebounder this season. He's down from what he was. Obviously, he was a tremendous rebounder for the couple of seasons there, and his rebounding effectiveness in terms of the way he rebounds, the ability to be the sole rebounder. And some of that obviously can be attributed to the addition of Kevin Durant, who's a really, really good rebounder. But I don't think he's as good a rebounder, and I don't think he's as good a shot blocker. And both of those seem to be sort of borne out in the statistics that there's a little bit of drop-off. Now, let me put that caveat in there, and I'm going to say Draymond Green, just past his prime, which I think where we are now, is still probably the best defensive player in the league, or close to it, depending on how you feel about Rudy Gobert. But I do think there's been a little bit of a decline, and when you watch him, he's just a quarter step slower than he was. And I'm not sure if it's age, if it's injuries, whatever it is, but I do feel like Draymond Green is a little bit past his prime right now. And I'll probably be proven wrong, so mark the tape, but go ahead and give me your take on this.
So I almost think that it would be a discredit to Draymond Green, or to someone's opinion on Draymond Green, if they didn't say what you said, because I think there are a lot of people that look at Draymond and say, oh, he's just as dominant as ever this season. And to me, that's a disservice to the player he was last year and the year before. And yeah, really the last 3 years defensively. I think Draymond was by far the best defensive player in the league over the last couple of seasons. Just because people think of him as, oh, he's versatile, he's a great switch guy, he's a great help guy. But it was so much more than that. It was like he was also probably a top 5 rim protector in the league. I mean, he
I don't think there's any probably to that. I think he was.
Right. So he was like a 90%, 95% approximate of Rudy Gobert, while also being the same thing of Kawhi Leonard on the perimeter. And then not to mention, just as a again, as a switch guy, as a help guy, the ability to break up 2-on-1s, 3-on-1s. I mean, we saw some of his ridiculous transition blocks. And I'm not talking about chase downs. I'm talking about getting back and protecting the rim against 2-on-1s, like against Portland last year. Just some of the most amazing individual effort defensive plays. We saw him make several game-winning defensive plays, whether it be stripping Kent Bazemore and then Paul Millsap on the next possession, whether it be stripping Anthony Davis on a game-ending isolation. He had a defensive season for the ages. And if you don't see a difference in the way Draymond's playing this year, you weren't really watching last year. So I do absolutely think that we're not seeing the same Draymond Green. Of course, like we've been talking about throughout the show, and I hate to just keep going back to like a a non-answer answer, because I hate when people do that, and I like to give more firm opinions. That's where we're at with this Golden State team, where we won't know until after this postseason whether his decreased play is a sign of decline or if it's a sign of pacing himself. Now, I do think there's still, something to be said for if a guy has to pace himself, you could say that they're declined. I would say LeBron James is declined just because he plays in the Eastern Conference and is allowed to take off the regular season. Doesn't mean that makes him an equally valuable player as he used to be when he could go 100% for 100 games rather than for the final 20 or so. And that might be the point we're at with Draymond Green. But does that matter? I mean, if we're going to get the most dominant version of Draymond Green this postseason, not so much. So right now, I don't think there's anything to say besides he is worse this regular season, and I don't know if that's a product of age or pacing.
So I think there are a couple things, and one of them is the eye test that I just don't feel like he's as intense, and probably, like you said, that can be attributed to just the way they've downplayed this season, and they're just trying to get to the postseason at this point. I don't feel like I don't feel like he personally is as intense as I've seen him. Now, that's something that can change 100% in the playoffs and probably will. But the things that I think have made Draymond less effective, and if you look back at his stat line from that 2015-16 season, it sort of overwhelms you when you look at it and you go, this player was unbelievable. If you just took the name off of it and looked at it, he was 14 points, 9.5 rebounds, 7.5 assists with 1.5 steals and 1.4 blocks. That is a guy who's out there doing it all. And part of it for me, part of the argument against Draymond Green is his effectiveness as a rebounder. Now his rebound numbers have dropped, which there's noise in that, like I said, because of Durant, but I feel like he's not as tenacious as when he is on plays where he's the solo rebounder. You don't see that tenacity that you saw a couple of years ago from him. See what that means. But the other thing is, the season that he was his best, the 2015-16 season, he was a 38% three-point shooter. Now that probably has been proven to be an aberration because you don't see that anywhere else, because he seems to be about a 30%, 32% three-point shooter in every other season. But the limited effectiveness of his spacing on 3 attempts, because his attempts have sort of stayed the same, but he's fallen off drastically. He's a 30% three-point shooter. And so to me, when you combine the less effectiveness as a solo rebounder, when he's the only one going for a defensive rebound, and then combine that with his inability to space the floor in the manner in which he used to do, what you have is a player who is still a fantastic player by any stretch of the imagination, but one that has certainly declined a little bit in the areas that made him A+ effective, numero uno when it comes to being that cog that makes the Warriors machine go.
I completely agree with you, and I'm glad you brought up the offense, because I have thought of this discussion more on the defensive end, just because that's where people think about Draymond Green's value. But he was absolutely a crucial part of that 2015-16 offense, and really throughout his career, he's also been a big part of the team's postseason offense. Now, I don't know if this is unsustainable, but he's a 34% shooter in the playoffs, but he shot 41% from three-point range, excuse me. He shot 41% from 3 last year and 36.5 the year before. So he's had 2 straight years where he's been an effective shooter out there. And that's always kind of been this team's checkmate move, is like, you have to leave Draymond open. And that's more a function of the other talent they have forcing you to leave someone open, and Draymond's the guy. And if he can knock down the open threes you're giving him, you're not going to stop the Warriors. It's series over. So we have seen him kind of raise that game in the playoffs, but that, of course, 3-point shooting is one of the most aberrational things when it comes to postseason performance, especially due to the low attempts, the high variance. That being said, I still think as an offensive player, he's a huge part of this team. His playmaking, he still leads the team in assists. He's still, his ability to grab and go. The rebounds are down since pre-Durant days, but he's at the same numbers as he was last year. 6.7 defensive boards, 7.9 overall. And then his ability to just push the ball in transition, make plays out of a short roll situation. And even when he's left wide open, he doesn't settle for the shot too often. He's at 3.7 attempts per game. Maybe Steve Kerr would like to see that number a little lower, but that's pretty low considering how many he could take. He still will generally attack that space and be able to make a play. So as long as the Warriors are getting that kind of contribution from Green, I think they'll be okay with his offensive ability. But if the question is about decline, we're never going to see that 2015-16 Green again. I don't think there's any question about that.
And that was basically my point before I burned Slack to the ground was
Right.
He had been so effective in that 2015-16 season that the ability to replicate that was probably just beyond him, not necessarily through any fault of his own, but because he played so spectacularly that we probably wouldn't see that level of play from him again. Now, a lot of these questions are about to be answered when we go into the playoffs, and we'll get a better idea of whether it is decline or whether it is just rest that has made him play the way he has. But at this point in time, I think maybe there's a little bit of a decline, just a little bit, and we're just past the peak of Draymond, because the peak of Draymond will probably always be 15-16, like you said. Now, you've done a pretty effective job refuting my 2 points. I'm glad I got to make them, because I know that you and I have sort of talked about these off air, but to put them down in print, or I guess suppose to record them in audio is a little bit nicer. But Simon, I appreciate you coming on the show today. Appreciate you taking time out of your day to talk Warriors with me. We're going to talk a lot more Warriors before this is all said and done, as you well know. But thanks for coming on.
Absolutely, Alex. It never really feels like taking time out of my day to talk about the Warriors. So
that's true. It's always nice to just get to talk hoops with some friends and just go about our business, because it doesn't really feel like business, like you said. So before we go, I'm going to give you the floor for a minute and let you plug on anything you want to get a plug in on.
Sure. So one thing is I just published a piece on the 94 Feet report about kind of the history of the point guard position and what direction it might be going and why that direction might be different than people think. And I kind of use Lonzo Ball as a centerpiece to frame that discussion. So definitely check that out. This is now coming up on a week old, but I think it's still relevant if you haven't heard it. I did a podcast on Steph Curry's 30th birthday, ranking the top 30 moments of his career. Warriors fans will love that, but I think everyone who's kind of watched basketball through the Steph Curry era would enjoy that. And I also just published on Low Post Gazette, which is my personal website, part 3 of a franchise player redraft, where me and 2 of my site's other writers redrafted the NBA through as if all 30 teams were blank slates. You can read more about the criteria and all of that there if you're so interested. And also check me out on the Swingmen, which will be coming out this Friday.
You're a busy man. I mean, that's just all there is to it. You are a guy with a full schedule, and you just get out there and you just love you some basketball. And it shows in your work, and I appreciate you being a part of the Swingmen, and I appreciate you coming on the podcast. And I just can't say enough how much I appreciate the contributions you've made to the 94 Feet over the past few months.
It's always a pleasure, Alex, and I'd love to have you on the restricted area soon as well.
Game on, baby. You know I love to talk basketball, so we'll have to set that up. But Simon, thanks for coming on. Everybody, thanks for listening. It's always a joy to get to do this. It's one of my favorite things, and I took some time off to get the Swingman up and running, but now we're back and rolling it, and it feels good to be back in the podcasting chair. So, Simon, thanks for coming on, man. We'll talk to you later, okay?
All right, sounds good, Alex.
All right.